wrap up this discussion of the day. The format for this is going to be that I'll tell you a tiny bit about all of the panelists, and then I am going to say a few words and pose a question to them. They each have 5 or 6 slides that they can refer to, and I'll advance them. But basically, we're going to try to have this as a conversation. The focus, this discussion is about futuring, but really it's going to be, I think, about teaching and about how we empower our students to think about the future and to move forward and into the world to practice. So very briefly, I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order in which they show up on my screen rather than where they're sitting. So you have to sort this out. But Kathleen Grevers has been teaching at RISD since 2001 in the Apparel department. She has over 20 years of experience as a technology-driven creative apparel and fabric artist. And her expertise is in technology research and implementation for the apparel industry with a background in surface design for home furnishings, automotive, and apparel. So we have a group of people here who all transgress the boundaries of what you might think of as their discipline. Ian Gonsher, over there with the beard, you've met him before here, is an artist, designer, and educator in Providence, and he's on the faculty of the School of Engineering at Brown, as you have heard, and associate director of the Brown Creative Mind Initiative, which has got to be wicked cool. Beth Mosher, in her practice-based research, blends scientific processes and design methodologies to probe the relationship between objects and culture, mining our cultural past and present for insights into the possibilities of our collective future. So we obviously had to have her, because that's perfect. Eric Anderson is teaching. His teaching and research encompasses the history of modern interiors, architecture, furniture, and product design. He's also teaching at RISD for the last few years. And Lily Herman is a professor of landscape architecture and teaches in urban design, landscape urbanism, design, architecture, international development, Islamic architecture, urban history, etc. She's the founder of the Design Lab at RISD, which brings design thinking practices and outcomes together with innovation and entrepreneurship to address issues of global poverty and social and environmental injustice. And I think that's everybody, right? I'm Ann Tate. I'm a professor of architecture here at RISD, and I am setting the stage for this discussion. There was a comment I heard last night when I picked up my daughter, who is working on a profile of a woman who's the seamstress at our local dry cleaners. And Michelle said to Katie, she was talking about the fact that when people come in with their garments and she says, I try not to let them see me cut their clothes when she's doing alterations, because they go, and her comment to this is, she said, your dress was not born, it was made. And this idea that the object, once finished, it has this integrity that you're not allowed to violate. It calls into question the whole process of making it and remaking it that Eureka was talking about how we think about changing things. So I just thought this was the idea that this object was not born, it was made, and that raises all the questions of who made it and how they made it and where it was made and what are the responsibilities of the designer or the maker in that case. We've been talking today about thinking about the future, and I think also, though, the other word that's been really important in this discussion is critical, and I think that as much as anything, today has been about recapturing the concept of critical and thinking about critical not as in snarky criticism and, I'm smarter than you are because I can figure out how to be negative about this thing that you're doing, but back to the concept of crucial, and that critical means let's focus on the critical questions and the crucial questions about how we make the future. So I think that we're getting to a point of criticism without cynicism, which would be a very interesting place to move academic discourse. And I have, so we're going to talk today about how we think about teaching and about students. I think that the role of education in this process of design, as we've talked about today, is incredibly important. And in the thinking about the role and the education of designers, I've had the chance to talk to various people around RISD and have recently suggested that we stop talking about being the best art school in the fill-in-the-blank, country, the world, the universe, whatever it is, and that we talk instead we ask ourselves the question of what would it mean to be the most important art school? What does it mean to use what we do to make a difference? And how do we help our students see their way to doing that? In a culture which obfuscates, not only uses aesthetics to obfuscate, but uses whole economic systems to obfuscate the issue of where things come from, what they're for, and what happens to them. And so today we're going to, in this piece of this, we had a preliminary discussion, some of us, about how you understand a moment for transformation, a moment, an opportunity, a historical opportunity, and it's a kind of intersection, understanding the intersection of place and time, where we are in space or where we are in place and where we are in time. And I think all of these teachers are working with their students to understand either particularly where the designer sits in the web of global production and consumption or where we are in history as we move forward. So that's the question I want to put to the panel to each answer for themselves. How do they address this question of where we are in space, in place, or in time, and in their teaching? So I'm going to start first with Ian because his slide is up first, and I'll advance them for you.
Thank you. So I thought I would just kind of start with a very quick some quick things to think about just to kind of frame the conversation in terms of creative problem solving, creative problem finding in education and design practice. And I want to start with a question. Why don't they call horseless carriages, why don't they call cars horseless carriages anymore? They're just as horseless now as they were a century ago, maybe more so. Horselessness is standard equipment on most models these days, right? The automobile developed out of and in opposition to familiar concepts associated with the horse and carriage. This was the familiar paradigm when the automobile first emerged. One day you had a mode of transportation that had this thing called the horse and this thing called the carriage, and then the next you didn't need the horse anymore. But the idea remained sublated in the subsequent concepts that emerged. Is there someone changing slides? Okay.
I'm a pencil-less designer.
So long after the automobile had made the horse and carriage obsolete and the association had faded, the concepts of each still define one another. This synthesis is still present today. Traces of the horse and carriage can be found in terms like horsepower and in the names of classic cars like Mustang, Colt, and Bronco. Consider the form of a car's design. You can see how four legs evolved into four wheels and headlights into eyes of metal beasts of burden rolling down the highway. The vestiges of these formative features still affect how we make sense of the built environment in our material culture, even if the original antecedents have been long forgotten. And it is in this understanding that these concepts emerge from the past that we might be able to extrapolate and to make predictions about the future. Next slide. You can think of this process as a creative dialectic, in which familiar ideas are negated and a new synthesis emerges. We compare this to that in order to give meaning to each and to orient our concepts to the things around us. These constraints make the things around us meaningful, but they also limit that meaning as well. However, we also have the option of moving beyond these constraints, opening up new territories of possibility. We can design between or within these constraints and affordances, between this and that, and we can design beyond them as well. By expanding the territory of possibilities and seeing solutions beyond the given constraints, we provide opportunities to play and win positive-sum games. Next slide. As educators and design practitioners, we are creative problem solvers. It is important to be able to think creatively within constraints, but also important to think beyond them too, to approach design problems both divergently and convergently. Divergent thinking is open towards many possibilities or solutions. Convergent thinking is closed towards a single or correct solution. Divergent thinking is open orientation, saying yes, deferring judgment, framing the possibilities in both and terms. Designers might call this ideation. Convergent thinking is saying no by making critical judgments, selecting this at the expense of that, framing the possibilities in either or terms. Convergent thinking closes off possibilities in order to develop and refine an idea and move the process forward. But both are necessary critical orientations for concretizing the abstract for translating the abstract into the concrete. The last slide.
I've got that computer problem.
So, for example, consider a seemingly insoluble problem. Consider how you might find a needle in a haystack. If we think divergently and we open ourselves up to imaginative possibilities, no matter how ridiculous, we begin to discover that there are many strategies to reframe problems, many solutions, and many ways to move beyond the apparent constraints. You might burn the hay, or you can use a magnet to find the needle in the haystack, in the ashes. Or you might consider putting the hay in water and allowing the hay to float and the needle not, easily separating the needle from the hay. Creative problem solving allows us to see beyond apparent constraints, seeing abundance where we might have originally only seen scarcity. Expanding the territory of possibility and creating new opportunities to allow us to move beyond a priori assumptions and zero-sum games as our default strategies for engaging in social critique. Creative practice and design strategies can give us the necessary frameworks to move towards positive-sum outcomes where designers work with all stakeholders to create win-wins that expand the territory of possibility and improve everyone's experience.
Thank you.
So I'm definitely not as eloquently stated as you, Ian, but there's a couple different processes that I found in the Apparel department's pedagogy of teaching, as well as the open doors that have happened at RISD for allowing faculty to explore nuances and different ways and dynamics of teaching. So one of the things that we do is we do an industry project, and this industry project spoke so clearly to me because it was all the aesthetics of being sustainable. Levi's has a huge amount of sustainable efforts. They've just launched a new product in Dockers called Well Thread, which is every stitch, every thread, every piece of it is transparent. You know where it's come from. It's almost like going to Whole Foods and seeing where the meat comes from. It's the same type of aesthetic and research. And what this project did with our students is that they were allowed to then create some sort of surface design, some sort of innovative way to produce the gene that's reproduced over and over again. Again, speaking to the marketability of it, but also speaking to the sustainability of it by using the Eureka Labs in San Francisco and being able to explore this type of product. So this materiality led to also a symposium that we did in October, which had a red thread of material, the exploration of leather, exploration of how to craft with leather. Is leather a sustainable product? Next slide. And then there was also an industry project in which we worked with Burton Snowboards. Totally off the beaten path of what Levi's offered to RISD, but a different way of looking at manufacturing, a different way of looking at local product, a different way of looking at design. The Apparel seniors all took a bus up to Burlington, Vermont, walked through their archives, understood the heritage, understood every aspect of designing for this company, and then created their own version of the product. Again, the transparency of understanding what the educational history is behind the company. And lastly, or second to lastly, this was a collaborative project that Apparel and ID did. This is a winter session class for shoe design in Italy. Keeper Nichols and I have had the honor to do this class for the last 3 years. The one thing that comes out of it, again, is material. The beautification of how Italian workers take pride in their product. It's not just a product that's commercialized. We go into, I guess what we would say, the homegrown local businesses and really understand their design aesthetic and how they produce their materials. This year was the first year that we also went into glass design. We went into lighting design. We saw all of these locally homegrown, for lack of a better term, products and designers. And we spoke to them, and the students were engaged with them and understood their theories. So it wasn't just Googling a product and understanding the internet aspect of a product, but really smelling it, looking at the design qualities, looking at how they produce it, looking at how the workers worked with each other, deeper than what the internet has for us. And then lastly, and in the material aspect, I started to learn more about fur. And I'm a vegetarian. I rescue dogs. I have 2 rabbits, guinea pigs, birds in my house, 3 kids, of course, not taking care of them, it's me. And so this aspect of understanding how to design with fur, I teetered with. But I went and I did it, and it was very interesting on how the relationship and sustainable aspects of really working fur in a way that you have 0 waste. And you can't afford to have any waste. So the dynamic of designing with this material was enlightening, to say the least. Thank you.
Cool.
Okay, so Anne questioned how we are using the term critical, and I would question whether we're all using design with the same meaning. So as Anne said, I run Design Lab, which stands for Design, Social Innovation, and Entrepreneurship, and some of our members are here. But this has really grown out. There are 3 of us who run this lab. There are 2 architects and I, and both of the other 2 architects are, one is a Cuban American on the faculty here, and the other is from Bogota, Colombia. And it really represents kind of our worldview, that we don't see a here and there, and we operate everywhere. But as somebody who has a background in science and history and design, I see design very broadly, and probably the person here who teaches whose approach to design is probably closest to my way of seeing it is Charlie Cannon, with his emphasis on systems design. And I do see it as systems, and I see design as actually working within systems and designing strategies, which is what Design Lab does. So the design of a product or architecture, which is the fields that we're all from, is often a tool and a means toward an end, but it is not the end itself. So we work on social and economic empowerment, and we work in many parts of the world. We work in South Asia, where I've been personally working for about close to 20 years. We work in post-conflict, post-disaster, or just economically very stressed communities. We work in Colombia and other parts of Latin America. We work now in Africa with Mass General Hospital. And to stay on this one for a second, Anne, because I want to mention this project. This is actually a new effort that we have started that has grown out of work done in the lab and work done in my courses, but it's about the Bay of Bengal. And it started with I'm using this as an example of how we think and how we operate. And so Anne asked us to talk about time and place. And for me, the Bay of Bengal is, again, it's a good example of how we think about this, because we started with 2 books. One is called by Sunil Amrith. It's called Crossing the Bay of Bengal, which is a very interesting book, but I had a problem with the title because it already marginalizes the bay itself. It's something to cross. And the other book is by Robert Kaplan called Monsoon. And Kaplan's book is about how the Bay of Bengal, which has 1/4 of the world's population living in the countries bordering it, it is the body of water that is most susceptible to sea level rise. It has the largest numbers of trafficked humans crossing it. On and on and on and on. This is one of the most important bodies of water in the world. And it's the one that's had some of the greatest amount of world trade since ancient times. And what Kaplan says is that with the rise of India and China, it's becoming the most important body of water yet again. All of all of their food that is grown outside of China, all of their oil and gas, all moves through the Bay of Bengal. Most of the world's piracy has moved from the coast of Somalia now to the Strait of Malacca, right off the Bay of Bengal. So we started this mapping project at MIT and at Harvard, and it's now come to Brown and RISD, which is about putting all of this information that we can find about the flows that Damien was talking about in his introductory talk, we're putting all of this into visual content. And we have planners, engineers, architects, landscape architects, and soon we'll have historians, economists, and everybody else as part of this project. So this is really how we think, and this is how we're trying to position our students, that there is no here and there. We are all interconnected. We actually always have been. And that we need to have this mindset in terms of how we can act responsibly going forward. So these are some of the issues that we've been working on. We're now building this new Center for Integrated Design and Development for post-Civil War, post-tsunami Sri Lanka, where we're actually trying to cross-pollinate between disciplines. Design Lab is an interdisciplinary initiative. And we're trying to build local capacity so that they actually have the tools they need to determine their own future. Thanks. Oh, and we work locally. This is in Central Falls, but I won't go into that. If anybody's interested, I can talk about it later.
And you could just run through all of my images. These are all images that might show up in design history classes that I teach. And they're all images of futures of one sort or another, themselves maybe critical in some ways, maybe not critical in some ways. I don't, in my design history classes at RISD, I don't necessarily teach the future per se or critical futures per se, but I am very interested in what art history can offer as a set of tools, maybe a set of disciplinary tools for interrogating images. Images are what we work with as art historians, and I think one thing that's really interesting today is we've seen a lot of images of the future of different sorts and different media, and to some extent we've been thinking about how to get beyond maybe the seductive surfaces of certain kinds of images of the future. And we've also been, I think, thinking today about what different disciplines can contribute, whether there are design disciplines or anthropology and sociology and aesthetics and art history. So when I ask students to look at these images of the future in the context of an art history course, and what I'm most interested in is finding tools for seeing each image as a way of making meaning out of an object or a space, and finding ways of sort of getting beyond the seductive surface of these images. And I think all these images that I pulled together here, somewhat at random from courses I'm teaching this semester, are in one way or another related to the aesthetics of modernism, maybe with the exception of that William Morris cabinet at the beginning. And they all, or at least a lot of them, rely on certain aesthetic characteristics of modernism, of geometric abstraction and dematerialization and lightness and sort of transcending the limits of materials and structure. But they all come from very particular ideas about the future and very particular considerations of their moment or of their place. And getting beyond the seductive surface of modernist aesthetics or these images, to me would mean kind of understanding the particular conditions of a place or a moment that were being responded to when these different visions of the future are being constructed. That's sort of the set of critical tools that I want my students to gain.
Thank you.
Out of order. Here, I need to go to the one that's... Sorry, I have to stand up because I made the mistake of having a cup of coffee. How do I do it? Just that one? I just want the...
Here, which one? This is the order they're in,
Okay.
but you have to get it on
there,
here.
that's
Just
what I want.
advance.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Is that what you want?
No, I want that. Hang on. All right. So, sorry, now we're all awake. So I'm Beth Mosher, and I teach in the ID Industrial Design Department, and I teach an advanced studio, so that's an undergrad class that's called Strategic Futures. And the goal, at least my goal, is to, Tate, you're famous, yeah. The student who did this is here. The goal is to get students to think strategically about the future, and then also to kind of bring it back and think strategically about the present. So that there are many challenges to this goal. The first is that in order to think strategically about the future, you have to know a lot about what's happened in the past and currently, and with students who are in college, you know, they haven't been alive that long, so they don't know that much about how everything's connected. So the first assignment I give them is they pick a basic object, a clothespin, in this case paper, and they have to make what I call an object web, which is all of the systems that allow that object to exist. So it could be systems of manufacturing, environmental systems, it could be systems of belief, however people expect to use it. And then once they have this mapped out for their object, then I ask them to break the web, to pull out one or two different key factors so that the object becomes extinct, right? So that's the first thing. We start with a present. And then the next thing we do is we go back in time. And I have students look at historical, in this case, art history. The painting has historical objects in it, along with use. And I want students to look at systems and objects that often, some evolved forward, and some of them didn't, and think about how those old systems and objects can be mined to produce things for the near future. Right, so like, I don't know if you can see in here, but a lot of people have this young man here is carrying his spoon in his hat, right? So there are all these different ways that if you think about, you know, disposable cutlery, or are you making it out of metal, and how many does every family need? If everyone has their own spoon, that's all you need, and you just carry it with you forever, right? So having students look back first before we start looking forward. So looking for insights and inspiration. Throughout the semester, as well, we're reading articles, students are reporting back, we're discussing current events. Again, trying to get everyone aware of the existing issues and sort of where they came from. So in the hopes that then we can look at those trends. They might be trends that die out, or they might be trends that move forward and increase in importance. So whether it's, you know, obesity or internet use or children's lack of exercise, we discuss all the different aspects, whether it's economic, social, health, all sorts of things. Now, how do I get out of the...
What did you want to do? Is it this one?
It's not that one.
It's back?
It's back. Whoop. There. Sorry, these are out of order. Okay. So then our first big main future project, because that's what the class is about, is strategic futures, is we do a strategic game. And the students are all sent out, our test case is RISD, and they're assigned a key stakeholder in the RISD community. And so they go out and they interview the person that they're then going to role play. So it's, you know, someone from the Board of Trustees, someone from Academic Affairs, the person who's in charge of risk assessment, parents as well. So they come together, it's a day-long session, and all the students play the role that they have, and they're given a scenario, which is a scenario in the future, where there's some stresses put on the organization. So the students have to decide I can't remember this one, they were talking about, so with global warming, of course, RISD is right along the canal, right? So what happens when the level of that canal rises? A lot of these buildings, like we would kind of be underwater right now. So they have to, the strategic game makes the students think about, first of all, they have to put themselves in someone else's shoes and think about what is it that motivates that person. And then as a group, they have to come up with solutions to sort of sudden imperatives that they're given in these scripts. Hang on, no, sorry. No, that's the one. Okay, so this is one of the things that students then went on and did from that. And what students do with all of our discussions of different trends, they set up a matrix with two key uncertainties, because that's the thing I think Cameron was talking about it earlier, though I don't know if you agree with this approach or not, but basically, can you predict the future? And the answer is, I think, no. Then what do you do with that? And in this case, what I have the students do for this particular assignment is they make a matrix. They choose two key uncertainties. This one is, let's say in the next 50 years, is the US economy going to be bad, or is it going to be strong, right? And then will we have addressed or started addressing issues with global climate change, or will we not have? And then the students pick a quadrant, and I have to tell you, with this technique, it's really boring if you pick the one where we all do everything right and we hold hands and sing songs. That's really boring. So students, I usually encourage them to pick something that's more challenging. And this is an example of, so they build then a scenario. So what does that mean? What could that possibly mean if the economy is doing well, but we're not addressing issues from global climate change? So it means that basically there's more conflict, right? People are fighting over scarce resources. There's less to go around. Things are unpredictable. There are food shortages. So how could the economy be doing well? And the scenario that they built in this case was that basically it becomes sort of like a bunker military mentality, right? That sort of we wall ourselves off from the rest of the world, and we're doing just fine, thank you, right? Even though the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And then where does RISD then, and this was all about RISD, how does RISD remain viable in this actually rather sinister scenario? So they have to think about what does that mean? And in this case, it means that RISD, this hotbed of creativity, we're making drones, we're working for the military, we're doing all these things, which in actual fact we could do right now. In fact, sometimes maybe we do. I don't know. I don't know everything that happens here. But the whole point of this, and then I should add on. So this is the type of projects we do. But then the last project, which I don't have enough slide space to do, but is the students then have to pick a brand that they're interested in and do the same thing for a brand. So figure out where are their vulnerabilities, pick key uncertainties, think about how that brand can survive in the existing, in the context that they're creating, the future context. And the reason that we do that, of course, is because our students need to have jobs when they graduate. And the whole, to my mind, the reason, because Anne was saying, well, why should we bother to teach students this kind of stuff? For me, it's good, I think, for students to know, first of all, to understand current context for their own work, and also to think strategically about how design can impact things, either for good or for ill. And hopefully, as they look forward into that future, they can start to have it impact the way they behave now. And then all of those students graduate, of course, and they all go off with all these thoughts and hopefully start impacting something. You never know. It could be, where you go, 14 years later, right? That someone remembers something that they learned. So, all right.
Thank you. Take this. I was just going to show a couple of slides from the course that Damien and I do on rethinking green urbanism, which is like this, is a kind of imaginative projection that we ask students to make about how they could think about the future. These slides were just images of how, using a very local and familiar context, how you could rethink Providence in this way that Lily's talking about, and to some extent Beth's talking about, of understanding systems and intervening in those systems. But this group was resolutely optimistic about the opportunity to make change. Another group said we should go to Mars. That was their answer. But I didn't have as many good slides of theirs. So these are just different ways to rethink resource management, water, adaptive reuse, and the rest. So I stole these questions from the first session because I knew we weren't going to answer them in the beginning. So I brought them back to this session. So I'd like to give the panelists a chance to, if they have any questions for each other in how we approach this. We have a very RISD overbalanced panel. So maybe I'll let Ian ask a question of the panel to start us off.
Well, maybe we'll start with the last one. Does it imply new modes of design pedagogy? And one of the things I was thinking about, trying to kind of see if there were some threads that we could tie all these things together, was I'm interested in this idea of prototyping in real-world context, iterative prototyping in real-world context. When you're in a studio, you're making little models, you're not hurting anybody. It's just kind of, it's there, you learn something from it, you make another one. When you're trying to design for social impact, you have to figure out a way of engaging your user in some way. And I would just be interested in kind of hearing, maybe from a historical perspective, maybe from some of the work you're doing in the field, other contexts. How should we be thinking about iterative prototyping when we're designing for a particular context?
It's an interesting question. And so we run a summer design build program in Central Falls. We also are doing design build work in Africa and in Sri Lanka. And this idea of iterative, I mean, first of all, we're working with the communities. And part of our goal is to make everything we do a learning experience for everybody involved. So we're trying to build capacity, build skills on all those levels. And in terms of both the first and the last question, and also the idea of iterative, we don't, first of all, we always engage for a very long time. We don't do projects. We go in and we have a long-term relationship out of which projects grow. And so the idea that we have a sustained involvement with a community means that anything that is physical design is evolving over time, that it's being used, it's being rethought, it's being changed, you know, that we're learning through watching it go through the role of doing what it was supposed to do within that society. And it was what it does and what it is was decided in partnership with the community it was designed for. But I do think, and I'm going to let somebody else talk, but I do think this you know, we are talking about more, I think, field-based learning now. You know, again, to go back to Anne's question about time and place, I feel, to be personal for a moment, that this is my time and place. I've been waiting for the whole time I've been at RISD for the students we have today. The students today are what I've always wanted. They're incredible. They are global in their mindset. They want to be engaged. They want to be in the world. And they have that opportunity. I really find, I don't know, there is something, again, to say there's no here and there, that's how our students think. And so I think we are at a critical point in terms of opportunity and in terms of how we can impact the world, but I also do think it's demanding new pedagogical models.
I think, Lily, that your point about iterative, taking Ian's question about iterative design and then putting it in place and in community goes to the questions that were raised, that Ijlal raised about projects that are done and then not reconsidered and redone, and that idea that we bring into it, this sort of studio discipline of making mistakes and learning how to correct them. World development doesn't usually give you that opportunity. We make mistakes and then we move on. But if you can get out of the kind of single stream solution, seeking and into understanding things with these more complex webs, it's inevitable that the web will lean into the solution in unexpected ways and create new opportunities and new things that have to happen. And that gives us this question of, cultivating agility among designers, not being, that's a positive, but with a value system for self-correcting and understanding when something is good or when you want to say no, as Cameron was saying earlier.
And just to kind of very quickly follow up on that, this idea of quickly prototyping and how we celebrate failure now, and being able to kind of look at that maybe with a different kind of critical orientation, because I think a lot of what we've heard today is like, when things fail, we need to learn something from it, but oftentimes it shuts down a kind of a path that may otherwise be fruitful if we kind of keep going in that direction. So it's that question of failure and quick prototyping. And I agree with everything you said about kind of getting to know the space and doing the research and getting to know the people. But it's also, it seems like when we're teaching product design, for example, we teach in a very different way. Quick, iterative, fail often, kind of just work through the process very quickly, little resolution prototyping. And I'm just curious to kind of how we can flesh that out a little bit more.
I come from a whole different standpoint, and you say, talking from the apparel world, fashion and sustainability, it doesn't connect. There's not a bridge between the two. So how do you teach a way for upcoming apparel designers to think about the broadness of what they're producing? How do you make them understand the transparencies, to understand every nuance of what they're creating, of where the materials come from, of who's making the materials, going back to history, understanding all the nuances of history and how we're going forward and how they can change things with the approaches of technology. I'm not 100% on the boat of 3D printing. I can't see the sustainable efforts of it yet. I'm completely exploring it more. But to teach that apparel student all those developments and how to make sure that they produce something and prototype something as transparent as possible, it's hard. It's definitely a challenge. But I think in doing so, you're really making, if there's a thread between fashion and sustainability, it's the transparency of education and historical value of what they're producing.
I think you also go to the question that has come up about worker systems and the whole culture of make it and break it, entrepreneurial, and there's an unfortunate relationship between that and the art school, as Caroline has been saying, that we're teaching everybody, go out there and make your own way and do your own thing, and good luck getting a pension. Or being able to retire or get old or have cracks in your face like Yuriko pottery. Not Yuriko, but the pottery. But the idea that this kind of agility, glorifying agility and flexibility and ability to get up after failure is all well and good, but in a system like Lily's talking about, where you have to stay in place and fix your mistakes and learn from them and make a new thing, or if in a company, there used to be, experimentation and failure and things within a system, but you were still secured within a job, and we've taken all that has come out of the system. And so, how we're preparing people in the celebrity culture, yeah, you could be a great success and go on and, be rich, but if not, how do you operate in these more complex webs, or how do we help people understand what they're going into and how to be successful in it? That's a big question, if any of you want to answer that. No.
I'm not going to answer that.
But, yeah, I didn't think so.
But it does bring to mind, so I think design's great. I love doing design. But I think it's a little bit like, if you're a podiatrist and you're trying to solve the world's problems, you make a shoe insert. And I sometimes feel like we have to be honest, there are a few, maybe not many, but there are some problems that design just isn't the right thing to fix. So you could design a wonderful thing to help someone be more independent at home as they age, that's great. But if all the people who are interested in that went and marched on Capitol Hill and got better funding to support people as they age, that would be even better. So I think I just want to mention that because I think we need to make sure that we're not designing inserts sometimes, shoe inserts, when we really need to be, changing the system.
Why isn't it an either or? Why is it either or, not a both and? Because you could make the argument that designing a better system, technology, let's say, to help people be more independent in their old age would help create more awareness, would help create more interest, and would help the political side of it. I mean, it goes to this question we've been exploring all day of the critique, the critical aspect of it, and that oftentimes critique is a kind of negation. It's a kind of, do this because it's at the expense of that. And I'm just wondering if that's the way we should be thinking about this. Maybe we should be thinking about it more as a kind of both and kind of thing, that they complement each other, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I still think that there's sometimes.
Right, of course.
But yeah, obviously, yeah. I think sometimes we just need to be honest that there are other ways that we as individuals can operate in the world aside from designing an object, a system, or whatever to solve the problem. Sometimes the problem is a political problem, and it could be that there's, or a funding problem.
That's a system, Beth.
It's a system, and it's a system that needs the transparency and the visualization skills and the ability to conceptualize alternatives that designers might bring to that. And, I think if you think about politicians and engineers and lawyers in certain categories of being, trained to think in certain columns, and designers are inherently trained, and artists, to think across that and to challenge those categories. And I think that, listening to Caroline's presentation and some of what Cameron was saying, really struck by this issue of kind of atomizing the community into individual artists versus, and even individual efforts like the plants in Argentina, where there, or the evergreen cooperatives. There are all these pieces, but we're still not using the pieces to challenge the bigger structures.
It's the
And
question
is
of the-
there an art project there?
It's a question of the generalist and the specialist, right? And I think that this is one of the reasons why design is so important, is because we are trained to be generalists in some respects. We're trained, all those categories of people that you described, the politicians, designers, whatever, they're all problem solvers, potentially creative problem solvers. And in order to solve problems in those ways and to kind of think beyond your own kind of way, your own specialization, you have to reach across different disciplines. And I think it's hard enough, I think teachers have a difficult time doing that. What I see in students oftentimes is that they don't. These kinds of, our specialties, our disciplines are things that we've kind of grown into, and we sometimes forget that problem solving moves across boundaries in very fluid ways. And I think that this goes to that. So
Yes, questions from the audience?
do you guys want a mic? Come grab a mic, yeah.
Yeah, we got 6 of them up here. We don't need them all.
Yeah, anybody that's talking should have a mic so we can get it on.
Throw them into the audience. Go ahead.
I'm a student in industrial design here at RISD, and just to comment on what both Ian and Beth said, I've worked with Ian in the past, and I know Beth just from being around the ID building. And I think that what's becoming complicated is that once I graduate from RISD, I don't feel comfortable calling myself a designer, even though that's what I'm being trained in technically, because I think that the way that we're thinking is just so much broader than what it used to mean. And I think that we're being taught to think strategically. And so putting yourself in the box of what a designer is kind of limiting. And so I think that a lot of us who are graduating now are struggling with the idea of like, what are we going to be? What are we doing next? Because we don't fit into the box of what used to be called the designer. And so I think a lot of the conversations today are kind of about what's the future and whether the profession, the title designer is even going to exist in the future, because the people who are being educated right now, such as lots of people in this room, are just being taught to think strategically, but there isn't a name for that yet. And
Maybe the name for that is designer.
maybe it could
And you
be
just have to,
designer.
you have to take it back from the people who make it, putting pretty images on something.
So I think it's under a transformation, this whole thing, and I think that we're trying to define something that is still undergoing so much change every day. And so I think that's where there are things that both of you said, different things in the same way, and the same thing in different ways, and so it's hard to define.
Yeah, next to you.
Hi. My question is kind of similar to Pachi's, but there's a lot of talking about designers and who's designing, and I think, Lily, you talk a lot about wanting to be part of that community and be local there, even though you're not necessarily local, so you make yourself local and you find these ways to be part of that community, but you're never, unless it's where you grew up, when you grew up there, and you're part of that, you're never fully going to be there. And I think something that just keeps running through my head in all of this is that, like, everyone who's sitting up here being the designers, talking about being the designers, and what Beth is saying about there are things that designers aren't supposed to fix. There are problems that need to be fixed, though, so maybe the question is about who is learning design and who are we teaching design to. And I mean, I think I'm also a Brown student, and there's a lot of conversation at Brown right now about sort of elitism in academia and the way that it is incredibly hard for people who come from lower socioeconomic standing to get to a university like Brown and learn these things that are supposed to change the world. And so you miss all of these perspectives from these people who probably have the most interesting things to say about the socioeconomics of American policy right now, or lots of things that Brown studies all the time. So, I mean, I think we've been talking about these missed perspectives, and how does a new design pedagogy center on making those people the designers instead of just accepting your limitation and saying, well, that's someone else's thing to fix. And I think I have a lot of respect for a designer to step back and say, no, I can't make I can't make a foot insert to fix this problem. But then how do they still encourage a solution?
And I think that what's been said about strategic thinking, and so that you have the great privileged luxury of taking time to develop skills, to think about these webs and interconnections, and that when you go to a new place, understanding how to bring that as a skill with attention and humility is part of what hopefully you might be learning. At 15, 25 years ago, you might not have been learning that. But I think you shouldn't, there's a difference between bringing a skill like that and having the innate knowledge and understanding which is going to do what in a given circumstance. Because having worked in a lot of different contexts and disciplines, there are a lot of people who don't have the ability to float over the circumstances and look further afield and see what some of the bigger solutions might be. And that's a real gift to bring in to a community that might have trouble. They might know a lot, like how to remake all the machinery and retake the factory, but they might not be able to see some of the opportunities, and knowing which is what and having that right thing, I think, is part of that.
It's hard to know if they do or don't know those things.
Exactly. That's what I mean about humility and attention and being able to understand when people do have that. Yeah, and then the panel.
So, hey there, I have a question sort of about the language that surrounds design culture, and sort of how rarefied it is and how obtuse it can be, and how completely uninviting it is to somebody who doesn't necessarily think about design on a daily basis. So I feel like there isn't really a good entry point in mass culture, whereas there is with like a dystopian sci-fi film sort of shows you a future that you might not want, and you don't look at you look at that, you say, I don't want it, but you don't necessarily think about the role of the designer in avoiding that. So do you see a way that we can have a gateway in mass media and sort of start that conversation on a much larger scale than the rarefied, done and Raby kind of speculative air?
I want to give that to the panel, but also I would like to invite anyone else who's been on the panels today to start to offer answers to some of that.
Something you wanted to say? I'd be interested.
I see you soon.
So I'm thinking about what you were asking, and I guess the thing that I hope that this critical turn invites is that designers don't need to only think in designerly ways, and we are not boxed into our occupational and professional training, right? That what coherent featuring needs and what moving into a future requires is engaged citizens, people who are applying creative problem solving in their home lives, in their domestic lives, in their political lives, in their neighborhoods. And these things are not, we know that each scale that we might live at and work at has different leverage points, but it requires, political action. It requires thinking about the kinds of things that we're engaging in, and it requires resistance. And those are human characteristics and human behaviors more, first. And there are designerly approaches to those things, certainly, but, I want to be a dad, I want to be a citizen, I want to be in the streets. And sometimes I have to wear different clothes and different roles to do that. But that's what I think is required of us.
Could I answer the media question? Yeah. How do you reach them? That's why I'm working on a book on fiction and design. Because I think that sometimes it's easier to read a story or to listen to other people's stories to understand, and if someone can sort of help interpret. I have no delusions that this will be Stephen King kind of reading that will reach that kind of mass audience. But I look for design criticism in places like the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. I also read desphilosophy.com and the usual suspects, but I'm interested in how people think through and with design situations as well as things. And I was thinking about the political question before. Ralph Kaplan, who's practically, he must be 99 now. He was, he's a lot of people have issues with him, and I think he can be very facile, and he's so tied into design and commerce and Herman Miller. But in his book, then what about why I can't unlock the door and Louis XIV's hotel or whatever it is, he has a chapter on the sit-in as situation design. It's absolutely something that's worth reading again, because now it operates under co-design, participatory design, but this was a way of viewing political action as changing the sensibility and the perception of the situation. I'm no Rancière scholar, but I do think that's another place you can go to think about the politics of of perception and the politics of aesthetics. And designers, I would argue, yes, we are mothers, fathers, and we want to put on different hats. So when I get on the train, I'm going to read a crappy mystery to relax. But I don't think you ever leave a mode of thinking. I mean, I just don't think you can, if it's a vocation.
I'm not a designer, but I've been involved in a lot of politics, electoral politics, street politics. And one of the things I've learned being married to Anne, who is a designer, is that there's a quality in design that is incredibly valuable. In politics, people have a tremendous difficulty articulating what they really want. And they're much better at articulating what they don't want. And so what that means is, left to themselves, a lot of conversations become, I don't want this, well, I don't want that. And what design can do in the right circumstances is help people, as has been said several times on the panel, visualize the future and identify a future that is not about not wanting things, but about wanting things. And I just want to say, for those of you who may not know, Anne had a tremendous impact in Somerville, Massachusetts. In 1998, she gave a lecture talking about the Assembly Square area, which is a large area in Somerville that was a dying big box zone. And she had offered a vision of what it could be if a new T-stop were put in, and if residents were put in, and businesses were put in, and so forth. And this vision was so startling and desirable that a citizens group was formed called Mystic.
He's getting this slightly mixed up.
Well, in any case, the point is, it is now a huge, beautiful, mixed-use T-stop place. Now, as Anne is doing this again with an area called Union Square. But as somebody in politics, I can say that the ability to take all these confusing negative feelings, which actually conceal positive desires, and then turn that into something that people can then discuss and negotiate, is an incredibly valuable tool in all those roles. Parenting.
The truth is that this was a community effort with the input, and what I brought to it with a number of other people was strictly the visualization of it, which did then enable the conversation to go into a different place, because people, I'd say, the way I say this to the students is, it's amazing, but most people can't see what isn't there. And that's the skill you bring, is the ability to see something that isn't there, and then people can get around that as a concept.
So,
thank you.
Building on the earlier, I just have a quick question, or a question.
Good.
Which is the reference was made to that our standard cultural model of thinking about the future is dystopian. I'm wondering how you, in your work, can alter that.
Do you guys, or to the panel for that, or does someone else in the audience want to answer that?
I mean, I have thoughts on that, but I would love to hear what people in the audience have to say, because I think it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Sorry, mine kind of relates to that, but so I might be a little bit cynical, but
You'd be the only person in the room.
I mean, the idea of designers as being kind of this great force is now a little bit arrogant to say, especially like because we haven't seen any of the ramifications. Because I mean, if you look at how design, like the history of design has become, we always think that we're doing the best thing possible, and we can always be as critical as we want, but we can never kind of see what the problems are until we get to that point. Aren't we being a little bit arrogant saying that we can solve all these problems?
One of the first public meetings I did, somebody said, "Why should we trust you? Aren't you the ones who screwed this up in the first place?" It's like,
but that goes to that iterative question, that failure. I mean,
but these
that's the
iterations.
it also goes to learning and bringing humility into it.
That's the risk, as I say.
But I think, I just want to say something to this, because I think we're in a period where we've gone through, at least in the architecture world, a period of extended self-flagellation after the failures of what are described as the failures of modernism. And the result was an excessive timidity and an unwillingness to take on any large-scale transformative projects. And so I would rather, at this point, urge people to be bold and smart and have humility and all that stuff, but to neither climb up into a tower or hide under a rock at this point when there's so much to be done. Is there one back there?
So I would just like to bring attention back to Sage's question earlier, and just think about how if we are going to take design seriously and to seriously think about it critically, how are we going to think about who's designing and who's empowered to think creatively and critically, and not just think of design as something, as the products of design and the systems as something that we're gifting to marginalized communities, but how are we empowering them to think themselves to improve their communities. So yeah, that was just...
Would the panel like to comment on how you do this with your students, how you have people think about the role of design?
So I'll make the comment that the collaborative classes that happen, especially with RISD Brown students and within the RISD community, I think there's a lot of design learning that happens between students, that happens between, you know, the collaborative class with shoe students. They're from all different disciplines. We have glass blowing and obviously ID, apparel, illustration, and to watch them problem solve, creating a functional sole of the shoe, and having the ID student help the glass blowing student to create the form, and then, you know, have the illustration student show how they can really draw the pattern to create the upper of the shoe. I think there's a very strong collaborative aspect that happens in this community, especially with Brown and RISD, and I think that is a pivotal point of problem solving.
And is that, do you think, is that a model for working with broader communities? Because the question raised is really what gives us as designers the right to think about that.
Interject
Yeah,
in that
please.
right here? I think the problem, yes, excellent question. The problem is with the word empowerment. We feel by using, we are going to empower this community. You've already taken, you know, the moral upper ground, right? The community is already thinking. You know, we're not going to empower them or teach them to design, think, and all that. Workers think, right? I mean, that's the ranciest big thing. It's just we don't have the tools to see how they think. Yeah, so the point is to learn ourselves how someone who works from 9 to 5 thinks, and there's creativity in that mode of thinking. We've imagined creativity is this flexible thing that happens at middle of the night, you know, in the late during, you know, when the bottle of scotch is like, you know. So all, we mythologize it, and not out of, you know, because of a certain historical moment. Demands of capital ask us to be so flexible, right? So we think that you can only be creative when you have the privilege to think of time in this flexible way.
But there's big C creativity and there's little C creativity.
Yeah.
Can I add?
Well, I'm sorry, say what?
There's big C creativity, like big genius creativity, and there's little C creativity, like everyday creativity.
No. What do you mean by big C creativity?
By what you're critiquing is big C creativity.
Can
the
I
idea
also
verified.
answer?
Oh, okay. So the big C creativity.
But little C creativity is more important. I mean, little things.
Exactly. Okay, so
Lily.
If I...
Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay, can I respond to Ijlal? Because I use that word empowerment, and I actually do believe that we have a role to play. I want to, you're Sage?
No.
Hi, Sage. I want to respond to Sage too, because first of all, when we go into a place, we are not becoming local. We know all too well that we are not of that place. And we only go into places where we're actually invited to come and to share something and to learn something. It's absolutely a two-way road, and we're working with very traumatized, in Sri Lanka, we're working with a truly traumatized society, and they are not empowered. They are not empowered in the sense that they have been overridden by a government that is dictatorial, that would like to see the population sail off into the skies and never come back. They don't have a voice politically. They have gotten to the point where they can't even believe they have the ability to fix their own water pump. I mean, these are people who at least believe they are not empowered. And so, Ijlal.
Sorry. No, I was talking to Amy. Yes. Please go ahead. I was holding on to the microphone.
Lily's going to empower you if you're not careful.
Please go ahead.
No, but I actually, I understand what you're saying, and I totally appreciate your, your cautioning us about being, either thinking we're somehow a savior or we have the answers. I agree with what Charlie said. I go in as a human. I don't go in as a designer.
No, absolutely. In your context, just to clarify, in your context, exactly, you need that, but I'm talking, I had a different context in mind than you,
I think this is,
yeah,
I think this, I'm going to Caroline. I think this is all about figuring out how to roll up your sleeves and get in there and do work with people in different contexts. Caroline.
I guess one way that I try and run meetings that are related to this disaster of urban renewal, for example, and all of the buildings that were bulldozed in New York City that did not become beautiful futures for many communities and instead remain asphalt and sometimes become community gardens, is to start community meetings around any new idea by saying, who's been here for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, keep your hand up if you were born and raised here, and then start with a conversation about what plans have been proposed before and what happened, just so we all remember that. And then as a teacher, I try and have students design for the classroom itself. Because I think it's sometimes an issue with design where people say, I don't understand why it wasn't implemented or why it wasn't continued. Why wasn't this garden taken care of for years? And then if you try and give yourself a solution and you have to manage it as a classroom for the entire semester, and you have to continue to deal with your potentially agonistic intimacies, your solutions for your fellow students, you're confronted with a lot of the realities that, for example, we are coming from so many different places, and even in the classroom there's conflict, and people are coming from the so-called communities that are supposed to be saved by the institution. So I think bringing it back to the classroom and saying, what is working here, what is not working here, how do we redesign the furniture? How do we redesign the way we speak to each other? And then how is that failing? Is one way to not imagine that we can save other people before we try and deal with the mess of being with ourselves.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I was going to put one more question to the panel, which is, but I don't want to cut off anybody in the audience. You, Damien?
I'll ask a question. Do you think, given we've had a very rich interdisciplinary discussion today, it's always interesting for me to think about who's here. We've got Lily, who's a designer with a PhD in history. We've got Beth, anthropologist, BA. We've got Anne, art history BA. We've got Daniel Peltz over there, former sociology and anthropology major. So we've got lots of mixings. We had a very mixed discussion. Let me ask you a political discussion about our institution. Have we done a good job in building the kinds of design education knowledges, plural, that could allow us to build the kinds of worlds that we'd like to bring into being? And I'm specifically thinking of RISD here.
Well, that's easy.
Well, I don't know if it's politically correct to answer this question, but I'll say it.
You have tenure, don't you?
Barely. I think there's a couple things. At RISD, it's great in that sometimes people don't pay a whole lot of attention to what you're doing. So you can try new things, right? A new topic for a class. But it also means that without great force of character, things don't continue because there's not institutional support. And I'm thinking force of character, Lily, and her design lab, right? That's all just her this whole time until I think very recently. So I think there's that. It's a mixed bag, on some level. Like I said, because no one's really paying attention. You can do some very interesting things, but trying to build momentum, you need more than just you to build that momentum. And I think then it's hard to get the institutional support you might need to, because students come and go, right? But to keep a project moving forward is, I think, quite difficult.
I'd just say one quick thing. Listen to the students. The students are the glue that hold it all together. And if you can create, that's how you create the institutional memory in the absence of the institution.
But they leave. And so, you know.
But there's new ones coming all the time. And they're
Right.
a community.
No, they're great.
And it's understanding student community and understanding how students, what they want out of their experience here. And listening to that rather than, I mean, I think sometimes faculty can be very distant from that. And I think that's sometimes why things don't continue, I think, is because students are the glue.
Can I just make one comment to that, because that gets confusing, because that goes back to Carolyn's point about wanting a job at the end of the day, they want a job. Right. So, you know, pushing the pedagogy and constantly making it morph to the final need of what they want.
It's both.
But that's, Kathleen, because you teach in a field where they get a job.
But
not everybody here does.
It's both. It should be co-learning. It should be both. Should be developing the curriculum and the ethos of the institution. And it shouldn't be top-down and it shouldn't be all bottom-up. It should meet in the middle.
I agree, and I think, to pick up on what Ian said, I think, you know, our students, we every year cry at graduation because we lose people that we don't want to lose. But I would actually argue that the school is getting a little better in not losing its graduates, that we actually are building a bigger network of alums and current students and faculty. And, you know, Gwen, who's there, is one of the people who's really leading the effort to try to have the resonance of RISD be out in the world in an ongoing way, where we are not so centralized, but we actually have a decentralized aspect where our alums are empowered to be part of who we are, and you know, that the teaching, that the learning, which we all do, you know, I think we are also moving toward a moment where the line between teacher and learner is not so clear, which I think is great. And it is going to have a bigger ripple effect, and there are a lot of things here happening now that are going in the right direction. So, you know, as they say, the arc may be long, but it's heading in the right direction.
I think that I think also that this event, and particularly the collection of RISD Brown collaborations, are one of the best signs about moving that in the right direction.
We're all the same community. I mean,
right, but we have failed to function that way, and we have not often had this level of discussion amongst ourselves, which is, I think, and in the broader community. I think that's really important. I don't want to end this without answering the questions that were asked at the beginning here, and I just want to say it's yes, yes, and yes. Thank you.
And I just add, a lot of the things we talked about today are featured on the website, cd-cf.org. There's articles from some of the speakers today. We'll be posting video, hopefully soonish, of today's proceedings. And we hope you guys stay in contact and stay connected to these conversations, because they're really important.
And thank you to Damien and Ian for really pulling all this together.